Well, good day ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Shaping Bay for another video. For today we take the opportunity to come back into the Shaping Bay and go over some questions that I get asked quite a lot in the comment sections here, and I've been getting quite a lot of messages from you guys on Instagram as well. So there's two questions that I seem to be getting a lot at the moment, and those two questions are to do with one, sanding, and two, how to not have your repair sitting proud on a flat surface. I would like to point out that although I'm drinking beer in all of these videos, I'm not an alcoholic, but there's a beer fridge and sometimes it's nice to come into the Shaping Bay, get some peace and quiet from the sander and just have a beer after work, you know. I should of course mention the merchandise. The apron I am sporting, you can buy it. You can see it has saved my white t-shirt from so much resin, paint, polish, all the rest. Get yourself an apron for sure. There is a link. There's hats and there's shirts and there's all kinds of stuff out there to get you looking cool, and it really does help me out. So if you got money to burn it on my apron. So the first question we're going to go over is, it's kind of a precursor to the sanding question. So the question is basically, if you have a flat surface and you add material on top of it, does that not make the repair proud? The answer to this question is of course yes. So here we have a funky looking fish, our bird's eye view and our side view. And let's say we have a ding right here. There's a hole in the board. So that's going to be just about there. And it's currently a low spot on the board because there's a hole in it, obviously. So our first steps in this repair are going to be to fill it with an expanding foam, and what that's going to do is leave us with a nice consistent line like that. So now we're back to how the board originally was. Of course we can't leave the repair like that. What we're going to end up doing is laying a piece of cloth on top of that, and then we're going to lay resin on top of that, and you can see that of course it leaves our surface proud of what it originally was. So if our repair is proud of what it originally was before it got dinged, then we're going to have a big lump in the board, which isn't ideal, but it seems like the inevitable doing a repair this way. That's not going to work. We could of course finish our repair, and then at the end when it's done we could sand it flat so that it's nice and flush like it was before the ding, but the problem with doing that is we've now sanded our entire repair off. And what I like to tell people is that repairing surfboards is not too dissimilar from fixing walls. So in New Zealand we call it jib stopping, but most people will call it interior plastering, and the skill set is very similar. So here we have a wall of a house. This is one sheet of plasterboard. This is a second sheet of plasterboard. That's a door for perspective. And in between these two sheets, there's a gap. So the gap needs to be plastered because otherwise when we paint it, you're going to see a big hole in the wall essentially. So what an interior plasterer needs to do is, just like a surfboard, he needs to fiberglass it. So he uses a tape, and using plaster instead of resin and tape instead of fiberglass, he puts that to seal up this gap. So now the gap's sealed. But now that tape is the same as the repair on the surfboard. It's sitting proud of the wall. And he knows that his repair or her repair is sitting high, so that's no good. You can't make the repair flat. So what a plasterer will do is the plasterer will put one coat of plaster on there, then wait for it to dry, then put a second coat of plaster like that, wait for that to dry, and then put a third coat of plaster and wait for that to dry. So although the ding or the gap in the wall was only that wide, by the time the repair is finished, it's maybe a foot wide total. This is the gap between our two sheets. Our plasterer has put tape, in our case fiberglass, over that gap. Then the plasterer has put one layer of plaster here and then waited for it to dry, another layer of plaster here and another layer of plaster here. In theory, the wider he can spread that plaster out, by the time he does his finished sand, the flatter the repair is going to look. Now he's working with a really big space because it's a wall. We're working with surfboard dings which are maybe that big, so we're working with a much smaller space. But the first tip would be, after you've put your cloth over your repair, when you're putting your hot coat or your resin coat, the further you can spread your resin coat over the board, the easier it is to trick the eye into the repair looking flat. Just like our plasterer's wall, our repair can't be flat. The trick or the art to plastering and a large part of surfboard repairs is tricking the eye so that it appears flat. If you're working in an area only this big, it's hard to make it flat. The more you can spread that repair out, in our case, our final resin pour out, the flatter it's going to appear. Now in our plasterer's case, there is a way that he can make this wall flat, and that would be to plaster the whole bloody wall. So that way your plaster is the same height in this area as it is in this area, and you're going to get a perfectly flat wall. Now in England they do that as a stock standard, I happen to know, but here in New Zealand the only way we'll do that is if maybe there's a window right here and that window shines critical light, they call it, onto that wall. So that light, just like in a shaping bay with those side lights, it's going to highlight this join. And if you don't do that finish over the entire wall, you're going to see that high spot in the wall every time the sun's shining through the window. Now with surfboards, they live in critical light. They're always at the beach, they're always in the sun, they're always wet, so that shimmers and reflects. So hiding that is incredibly difficult. So our level 5 finish as a surfboard repairer would be to resin the entire bloody board, because then we can get an even thickness of resin over the whole thing. But if we started out with a ding like this, nobody's going to pay us to hot coat an entire board to make that flat. So the first point I would say in all of this is, don't make the mistake, which I have definitely made before, of being too fussy. As ding repairers, we get paid nowhere near something that a plasterer gets paid, and ultimately we're working on a really small area which is all but impossible to make flat. So within your skill range, within what you can afford as a business, or if you're just doing it for friends, what you're willing to give, make your repair as big as possible on that last resin pour, but don't overly analyze your repair and feel guilty because you might see or feel a little ridge where your repair was. I'm sure someone out there will point out that if you were to sand the foam we filled the ding with low, and then only put cloth in that low spot and build it up to the original level, then it would, in theory, be flat. This is certainly possible with some dings, generally bigger dings, but it's pretty rare. The vast majority of dings, you're not going to be able to do that. So if you can get away with doing that, do it. But generally, you're going to have a high spot where your repair was. So that brings us to our second question. And the question is, how do I do the final sand and sand away the edge of that final resin coat without exposing either my own fiberglass cloth or the fiberglass cloth of the original lamination on the board next to my repair? Now largely this comes with practice. The more you do it, the more you get used to it, but I can give you a few tips that are hopefully going to help you in your final sanding process. So let's say we started with a hole in our whiteboard like that, and we filled that, made it flat, and now we're going to fiberglass cloth it. So we get a piece of fiberglass cloth like that. There's probably threads and all kinds of crap pulling out of it, but we wet that out, and then we add our final resin coat, which if you mask it off, it might look something like that. And if you don't mask it off, it might look something more like that. But either way, now that our resin is cured, we need to sand it as flat as we possibly can. That looks obscene. So generally at this stage, before I've done all of this, the board has been sanded with 120. So this whole area here, because I've sanded much wider than where my final repair is going to be, so I've got good adhesion, All of this yellow is 120 scratches, and everything inside this red is fresh resin. So from the very get-go, I'm going to begin this part of the process with 240 grit. So 240 grit is going to be harsh enough to kind of do what we need to do with all of our red, but it's also going to turn all of our 120 scratches around here into 240 scratches. So we're one step closer to polishing or painting. Now this edge here, I normally leave that until the end. So the first step I'm going to do is 240 all of this completely flat so it's smooth, there's no shiny bits, and I'm not going to worry about this edge here yet. So now we have 240 scratches all through the middle here, and then we have fresh resin around the edge here. So we need to knock that edge down and blend it into the original part of the board. Now the best way to think about this, I think, is to treat your sander as if it were a planer. So imagine we had a piece of wood here and it's got a high bit. That's essentially what this resin edge is. We can either say this is a piece of timber with a high spot that we want to knock down flush, or we could say this is our repair here and this is our original board here, so our resin edge is slightly high. So if we were to plane this, we wouldn't plane it that way or even that way in order to knock that edge down. It's just not going to work. So we're going to treat our repair edges the same way. We're not going to use our 240 grit and sand this edge, for instance, that way. We're going to be moving it up and down that edge, keeping a little more pressure here and little pressure here. So we're trying to buzz that edge down flat. The bigger this resin patch is, then the more gradual our ramp down to the original board is going to be, and the flatter it's going to look. If our resin pour is really small, then we're going to have a really short, sharp ramp, and it'll be obvious that this is a high spot. So once this edge is kind of feathered nicely in, then we're going to do the exact same thing this way, and then we're going to do the exact same thing this way, and we're going to do the exact same thing this way, and now we have a nice feathered edge all the way. So now we're going to change to 320. So then it's usually at this spot, if you didn't do it with your 240, that you're going to start to see a little bit of fiberglass cloth coming through if you've gone that far. Your 320 is more likely to take that little bit of extra resin off than you intended, and now you're starting to see a bit of weave of cloth. Depending where you're seeing that weave of cloth depends whether or not it's going to be an issue. So let's pretend for a second that this surfboard is it's 4 years old. The guy uses it every time there's swell, or the girl uses it every time there's swell, and we're starting to see a little bit of fiberglass cloth showing up here. So this is our cloth over the repair that we were paid to fix, or that we've offered our friend to fix, and now we're starting to see cloth. Now keep in mind, the only place there's damage is there. All of this is bonus, and underneath this is just more of the original fiberglass of the board. So the question you have to ask yourself is, structurally, does it really matter that you're seeing fiberglass cloth here? Because underneath it, there's more fiberglass cloth. If we start to see fiberglass cloth appearing here or here, then this is where we have to start worrying, because this is the original lamination of the board, and underneath our resin is also the original lamination of the board. And then we've only got foam underneath that. Same goes if we start to see fiberglass cloth appearing here over where the actual ding was, because underneath that is our foam, and that's it. So keep an eye on where that fiberglass cloth weave is coming through, and then decide whether it's important. If we pretend for a moment we're working on a brand new board, let's say the dude or the Sheila just bought it, brand new, first surf, first wave, boom, big hole in it. It's starting to look a bit crap because now you can see fiberglass cloth where your repair is. Well, there is an easy solution to that. The easy solution is to put more resin over it. So if we've got our brand new board, so we start sanding with our 240, and then we start seeing some cloth coming through here, let's say. It's not over our repair, and underneath it is original fiberglass, so it doesn't really matter, but it's just not going to look good. You don't want the repair to be obvious. So what I would do in this case, I would switch from our 240, I'd go back to 120. Yellow is 120 now. And then I would sand the entire thing with 120, same as before. So I'm just flattening all of this out. And then I would knock this edge down, and I'm gonna do one more really tight coat of resin. You can even use the squeegee if you want instead of a brush. And I'm gonna go just a little bit further, like that. We've already sanded the repair pretty flat. We've sanded this lip down, and then if we've squeegeed this resin on or put it on really tight with the brush, it's gonna make sanding it flat really easy because it's only a super thin layer of resin, and it's gonna mask where we started to expose our fiberglass cloth on our repair. Other than that, don't be so harsh on yourself. It happens, cloth gets exposed. Just check where it is and check if it really matters. And if it's a really nice board and you really don't want your repair to look like that, then you can always wax some more resin over it. The beauty of plaster and fiberglass is if you mess it up, you can always sand it all off and start all over again. So there really is no going wrong. It might take more time, it might cost a little more money, but ultimately it's reversible. At least we're not concreters, eh? I would say a third question I do get occasionally is about the sander type. So I use a Mirka. It's a really good sander, but it's super expensive, and I definitely wouldn't recommend it if you're not in the business of fixing dings. If you are in the business of fixing dings, I would highly recommend it. But I would say if you're buying a sander to start repairing boards with, interchangeable speeds is really important. And then the other thing that I think is overlooked is its height. The closer you can get your hand to the board, the more it's going to feel like hand sanding. So I started out using cordless Makita sanders, and they're really tall. So it left my hand about a foot above the board, which made it really hard to do sort of precise sanding. The Mirka, or however you say it, is really low to the board, so it feels like I'm hand sanding. I will just add one other little snippet to this while I'm filming these sanders for this video. Make sure you get yourself an interface pad. So this is a thick piece of foam and it's spongy. So it's gonna help mold to the shape of whatever you are sanding. Something else that's gonna help you sand through really quickly is digging the sander in. It's really tempting for beginners if they're trying to sand an edge away really fast. They don't hold the sander flat, they put it on an angle and they dig. My first job out of school, I was an apprentice as an automotive painter, and the guy who taught me, if he ever saw me sanding like that at an angle, he would come up behind me with 36 grit sandpaper and he would run it down my arm and carve my arm up. About an hour later, he'd come with some Prepsol or thinners in a spray bottle and he'd spray my arm with it. It was really painful, but it taught me very rapidly to always keep the sander flat. So that's basically it, guys. Those are the tips I can give you when it comes to sanding. Aside from that, just practice and sanding more and more repairs, and it just kind of becomes muscle memory, really. If there's any other ideas you want to see, particular repairs, let me know. Chuck it in the comments. Snaps is definitely one that's on my list, but I just haven't had a snap come in quite a while, actually. Good for me, bad for you. Other than that, have a good one, guys. We'll see you in the next one. Thank you very much. Cheers!